There is a version of you that exists only in the minds of other people. It is not the real you. It has never eaten your meals, carried your worries, or lain awake with your particular fears at 3 in the morning. And yet, for most of your life, you have quietly organized your choices around keeping that imaginary version presentable. You have softened opinions before speaking them. You have delayed decisions until you could predict how they would be received. You have measured your own worth by a number you can never actually see, the number of people who approve of you at any given moment. This is not weakness. It is simply what happens to a mind that has never been taught the difference between being seen and being owned. Somewhere along the way, the need to be understood quietly turned into the need to be accepted, and the need to be accepted turned into something closer to obedience. You began asking, before almost anything else, a single silent question. What will they think? That question has shaped careers you did not want, friendships you did not choose, and silences you now regret. It has cost you the plainest form of freedom there is, the freedom to simply be who you are, without first checking whether it is allowed. What follows is not a lesson in indifference or coldness. It is something far more precise. It is an examination of how the human mind builds an audience out of thin air, why that audience feels so real, and what happens the moment you stop performing for it. You will come to understand why approval feels like survival, why criticism lands so much harder than praise, and why the people who seem most free are not the ones who were never watched, but the ones who simply stopped watching themselves through other people's eyes. By the time this journey ends, you will not have learned to ignore the world. You will have learned something rarer. You will have learned how to remain fully present in it, while no longer being ruled by it. And in that shift lies a form of power that cannot be given to you and cannot be taken away, because it was never something anyone else was holding in the first place. Chapter 1. The Invisible Audience. You have been performing, for before you learned to read, before you understood the meaning of the word opinion, you had already begun performing. A child does not choose an audience deliberately. The audience simply appears, made of parents, teachers, older siblings, and eventually strangers whose approval seemed to matter for reasons no one ever explained. Their glances became a kind of currency. Their silence became a kind of verdict. And somewhere in that early education, a permanent structure was built inside your mind. A private theater with an audience that never fully leaves. This audience does not require anyone to actually be present. That is the strange power of it. You can be entirely alone, in a quiet room with no witnesses at all, and still feel the pull of imagined eyes evaluating your next move. You may hesitate before sending a message, rehearsing it several times, not because the words are unclear, but because you are running a simulation of how it will be received. You may abandon a plan, not because it lacks merit, but because you can already hear the questions it would provoke. This is not paranoia. It is simply what happens when a mind has spent years training itself to anticipate judgment before judgment ever arrives. The audience is rarely a single person. It is a composite, built from every disapproving look you ever absorbed, every raised eyebrow, every moment someone's warmth toward you seemed to depend on your compliance. Over time, these fragments merge into a single internal presence, one that speaks in a voice remarkably similar to your own thoughts, which is precisely why it is so difficult to detect. You do not experience it as an external voice telling you what to do. You experience it as your own judgment, your own good sense, your own caution. This disguise is what gives it so much authority. Consider how differently you behave when you believe you are truly unobserved, compared to when you sense, even faintly, that someone might be watching. The difference reveals the presence of the audience more clearly than any conversation could. A person alone in their car will sing loudly, badly, joyfully. The same person, aware of another driver glancing over, will suddenly stop. Nothing about the song changed. Only the belief about who might be judging it changed. Multiply that small example across every domain of your life, your career choices, your friendships, your appearance, your beliefs, and you begin to see how much of what feels like your personality is actually a long negotiation with people who are not even present to negotiate. This is not a flaw unique to you. It is close to universal, which is precisely why it so rarely gets questioned. When an entire culture performs for the same invisible panel, the performance itself starts to look like normal behavior, rather than a constructed habit. People compliment each other on being agreeable, easy to work with, low maintenance, without recognizing that these are often just polished descriptions of a person who has learned to disappear convincingly in front of others. The first step toward reclaiming your power is not to eliminate this audience through sheer willpower. That rarely works, because willpower cannot dissolve something it does not fully understand. The first step is simply to notice it, to catch yourself mid-hesitation and ask a direct question. Whose voice is this? Who exactly am I imagining right now? And what authority did I give them over this decision? Often, when you trace the voice back to its source, you find someone from years ago, someone whose opinion may no longer even be relevant to your current life, still quietly running committee meetings in your head. Noticing the audience does not make it vanish immediately, but it changes your relationship to it. Instead of being fused with the voice, mistaking it for your own reasoning, you begin to see it as a separate presence, one you can observe rather than obey. This separation is the beginning of everything that follows in this journey. Because power does not begin with defeating the audience. It begins with realizing, perhaps for the first time in your adult life, that you were never required to seek their permission in the first place. Chapter 2. Why approval feels like survival. There is a reason the fear of disapproval feels so disproportionate to the actual danger involved. Losing a friend's warm opinion of you will not end your life. Being misunderstood by a colleague will not remove your access to food, shelter, or safety. And yet the body often reacts to social rejection with a level of alarm typically reserved for physical threat. The heart quickens, the stomach tightens, the mind loops obsessively over a single sentence someone said in passing. This reaction is not a personal weakness. It is an inheritance, and understanding its origin is the first real step toward loosening its grip. For most of human history, belonging to a group was not a preference. It was a condition of survival. A person separated from their tribe faced exposure, starvation, and predation with almost no chance of enduring alone. In that environment, the opinion of the group was not a minor social concern. It was a direct signal about whether you would continue to have food, protection, and shelter. A person who ignored the disapproval of the group risked exile, and exile, in that context, was frequently a death sentence. The nervous system that evolved under these conditions did not disappear simply because modern life changed the stakes. It is still running the same ancient alarm system, still treating a raised eyebrow in a meeting as though it might be the first sign of expulsion from the tribe. This explains why criticism can feel physically painful even when it carries no real consequence. The brain does not carefully distinguish between a threat to your body and a threat to your social standing. Both activate overlapping systems associated with distress. This is why an unkind comment from a stranger online, someone you will never meet, whose opinion has no bearing on your actual life, can still disturb your entire evening. The rational mind understands that the comment changes nothing material. The ancient nervous system, however, is still operating as though your continued place in the group is at stake. Understanding this origin does something important. It removes shame from the reaction. Many people quietly believe that caring too much about others' opinions is a personal defect, evidence of weakness or insecurity. But this response is not a defect. It is a deeply wired survival mechanism, present in every human being who has ever lived, simply activated more or less intensely, depending on early experience and temperament. You are not broken for feeling the sting of disapproval. You are functioning exactly as your biology designed you to function. However, recognizing the origin of the fear is not the same as accepting its current authority over your decisions. The mechanism that once protected your ancestors from starvation is now frequently misapplied to situations with no real survival stakes at all. A critical email, a disapproving relative, a stranger's passing comment. The alarm still fires, but the danger it once responded to has largely disappeared. Your task is not to silence the alarm entirely, because it will always exist in some form. Your task is to learn to evaluate its signal rather than obey it automatically. This distinction becomes easier once you begin asking a simple question whenever the fear of disapproval arises. Is this a genuine threat to something I actually depend on, or is this an outdated alarm reacting to a modern situation that carries no real danger? A boss's disapproval of your work performance may carry real consequences worth addressing. A stranger's disapproval of your appearance, your choices, or your lifestyle usually carries none. Learning to separate these two categories, consequence and noise, is one of the most practical skills you can develop, because it allows you to keep the parts of the alarm system that genuinely protect you, while gradually loosening the grip of the parts that do not. The ancient mind wanted only one thing: to keep you inside the circle of safety. But the circle it is defending no longer exists in the way it once did. You are not standing outside a tribal fire, facing exile into the wilderness. You are, in most cases, simply facing another human being with their own limited perspective, their own history, and their own reasons for thinking what they think. Once you understand that the fear you feel is inherited rather than accurate, you gain the ability to feel it without being ruled by it. And that ability is where real power begins. Chapter 3. The origin of the watching mind. Every person carries a foundational memory, often too early to consciously recall in detail, in which being seen and being loved first became fused into a single experience. Long before language, an infant learns that a parent's attention is directly connected to comfort, safety, and survival. When the caregiver looks toward the child with warmth, the child's nervous system registers safety. When the caregiver looks away, distracted, distant, or displeased, the child's nervous system registers a kind of alarm. This early pattern, repeated thousands of times before a single word is spoken, becomes the blueprint for how a person will relate to attention and approval for the rest of their life. As a child grows, this blueprint becomes more specific. Praise for certain behaviors and disapproval for others teaches the child which parts of themselves are acceptable to display and which parts must be hidden or suppressed to maintain connection. A child who is praised only for achievement may learn to equate worth with performance. A child who is scolded for expressing anger may learn to equate emotional honesty with danger. None of this happens through deliberate instruction. It happens through thousands of small, cumulative signals, absorbed long before the child has any conceptual framework to evaluate whether those signals are fair or accurate. By adulthood, most people have forgotten the specific incidents that shaped these patterns. What remains is not the memory, but the rule the memory produced. A person who learned early that vulnerability led to ridicule may, decades later, find themselves inexplicably guarded in close relationships, without ever consciously connecting this guardedness to its origin. A person who learned that disagreement led to withdrawal of affection may find themselves agreeing with people they privately oppose, still following a rule written before they were old enough to question it. This is why the watching mind feels so automatic, so seemingly built into your personality rather than something learned. It was assembled during a period of life when you had no capacity to critically evaluate the messages you were receiving. A child cannot say to a disapproving parent, "Your standard for what deserves love is unreasonable." A child can only adapt, because adaptation is what survival requires at that age. The tragedy is not that this adaptation occurred. Adaptation was necessary and intelligent given the child's circumstances. The tragedy is that many adults continue operating according to rules designed for a much smaller, much more dependent version of themselves, long after the actual dependency has ended. Recognizing this origin allows for something important: a distinction between the rule and the person who created the rule's necessity. The parent, teacher, or early authority figure, whose approval once felt like oxygen, is very likely no longer in a position of such total power over your life. Yet the internal rule they installed often continues operating, as though nothing has changed, as though your survival still depends on their continued approval. Updating this internal software requires deliberate, repeated recognition that the original conditions no longer apply. This process is not about blaming the people who shaped you. Most parents and early caregivers were themselves operating under rules installed by their own upbringing, doing the best they understood how to do with the tools they had. The purpose of examining this origin is not condemnation. It is simply clarity, the ability to see the architecture of your own reactions clearly enough to begin renovating it. One useful practice is to notice, in moments of unusual emotional intensity around approval or disapproval, whether the intensity of your reaction matches the actual stakes of the present situation. If a mild, harmless comment from a colleague produces a level of distress that seems disproportionate, it is worth asking gently, without judgment, where this reaction was first learned. Often, beneath the immediate irritation or hurt, there is an older, quieter feeling, one that predates the current relationship entirely. Identifying this does not immediately dissolve the reaction, but it begins loosening its automatic grip, because a pattern that is seen clearly has already lost some of its power to operate invisibly. The watching mind was built by necessity in a period of genuine dependency. It does not need to be destroyed. It needs to be updated, gently and repeatedly, until it reflects the reality of who you have become, rather than the reality of who you once had to be in order to survive. Chapter 4. The cost of a borrowed identity. When choices are consistently shaped around avoiding disapproval, a subtle transformation occurs over time. The self that remains standing at the end of each day is not the self that would have existed had those choices been made freely. It is a smaller self, carefully edited shaped less by genuine preference than by the anticipated reactions of others. This edited self can function for years, even decades, appearing outwardly successful, socially comfortable, and reasonably content. But underneath that functioning is often a quiet, persistent sense that something essential has gone missing, a feeling many people struggle to name, because nothing dramatic has visibly gone wrong. This cost accumulates slowly, which is part of what makes it so difficult to notice. A single decision made to please someone else, a career path chosen because it seemed respectable, rather than because it felt meaningful, a relationship maintained out of obligation rather than genuine connection, rarely feels significant in isolation. It is only when these small accommodations stack together across years that the pattern becomes visible, usually during a moment of crisis, exhaustion, or unexpected loss, when a person suddenly asks themselves how they arrived at a life that looks correct from the outside, but feels unfamiliar from within. The borrowed identity is built from fragments of what others seemed to want. A parent's expectation shapes the choice of career. A partner's preference shapes the suppression of certain opinions. A social circle's values shape which interests are allowed to be openly enjoyed and which must be kept private, almost secret. None of these fragments are inherently harmful in isolation. The difficulty arises when the fragments accumulate into something larger than any individual choice, a personality constructed primarily as a response to expectation rather than as an expression of genuine preference. One of the clearest signs of a borrowed identity is difficulty answering simple questions about personal preference without first considering how the answer will be received. What do you actually want? Many people ask this question directly, experience a strange hesitation, not because they lack opinions, but because they have spent so long filtering their opinions through the lens of acceptability that the original, unfiltered preference has become difficult to locate. The muscle required to know your own mind independently of external reaction atrophies from disuse, much like any other muscle that goes unused for long enough. This is not merely a philosophical inconvenience. It has practical consequences that compound over time. A person living a borrowed identity tends to make decisions that look reasonable on paper, but feel hollow in practice, because the decisions were optimized for approval rather than for genuine fulfillment. Careers chosen for prestige rather than interest often produce competent but joyless professionals. Relationships maintained to avoid conflict rather than because of authentic connection often produce polite but distant partnerships. The external structure holds, but the internal experience gradually erodes. Reclaiming an authentic identity does not require dramatic rebellion or the wholesale rejection of every external influence in your life. Many of the values you have absorbed from family, culture, and community are genuinely worth keeping, not because they were imposed, but because upon honest examination, they align with what you actually believe. The task is not to discard everything inherited and start from nothing. The task is to examine each belief, preference, and choice individually and ask a direct question. Is this mine, arrived at through my own reasoning and experience, or is this simply the path of least resistance toward continued approval? This examination often begins in small, almost mundane areas of life, before extending into larger ones. Noticing that you enjoy a particular hobby only when no one else is present to judge it, and asking why that difference exists. Noticing that you agree with a friend's opinion more readily in their presence than you would if reflecting on the same topic alone, and asking what that reveals. These small moments of noticing, repeated consistently, begin to rebuild the muscle of independent preference that the borrowed identity had allowed to weaken. The reward for this work is not simply comfort. It is coherence, the rare and valuable experience of a life that matches on the inside what it appears to be on the outside. A person living from an authentic identity may still face criticism, disagreement, and disapproval, because no version of a life, however honest, pleases everyone. But the criticism they face is aimed at something real, at choices they actually made, for reasons they actually hold, rather than at a performance constructed primarily to avoid exactly this kind of scrutiny. There is a peculiar freedom in this, the freedom of finally being criticized, if criticized at all, for being yourself, rather than for failing at an impersonation. Chapter 5. What other people are actually thinking about you. There is a quiet, almost uncomfortable truth that, once genuinely absorbed, changes the entire emotional weather of a person's life. Most people are not thinking about you nearly as often, or as critically, as your anxious mind assumes. This is not a comforting exaggeration offered to make you feel better. It is a fairly accurate description of how human attention actually works, and understanding it requires only a small amount of honest self-observation. Consider, for a moment, how much mental space other people occupy in your own daily experience. You are almost certainly preoccupied, most of the time, with your own concerns, your own deadlines, your own relationships, your own minor anxieties about how you appeared in a conversation an hour ago. Other people exist in your awareness, mostly in brief flashes. A passing thought about a colleague's comment, quickly replaced by a concern about your own upcoming appointment. If this is true of your own mind, and it almost certainly is, then it is very likely equally true of the minds of everyone around you. They are not devoting sustained, careful attention to evaluating you. They are, in the vast majority of moments, absorbed in the same self-focused internal narration that occupies you. This is sometimes called the spotlight effect in psychological research, the tendency to dramatically overestimate how much other people notice and remember about our appearance, mistakes, and behavior. Studies on this phenomenon consistently reveal the same pattern. A person convinced that a minor mistake or an unflattering outfit was obvious and memorable to everyone in the room discovers, upon actually asking, that almost no one noticed at all, and those who did had already forgotten by the following day. The spotlight you imagine shining on your every flaw is, in nearly every case, a fiction generated entirely by your own anxious attention, not by the actual attention of others. This does not mean people never form opinions about you. They do, but these opinions are typically far more fleeting, far less detailed, and far less consequential than the imagined verdicts your mind constructs. A stranger's passing judgment about your clothing, choice at a social gathering will likely dissolve from their memory within hours, replaced by their own concerns. Yet that same fleeting judgment, imagined rather than confirmed, can occupy your mind for days, replayed and analyzed, as though it were a permanent verdict rather than a momentary, largely inconsequential thought that has already left the other person's awareness entirely. Even among people who genuinely do think about you, with some regularity, family, close friends, romantic partners, their thoughts are rarely the harsh, comprehensive audits your anxious mind imagines. They are more often brief, fond, occasionally critical, frequently affectionate, and almost never as detailed or damning as the version constructed in your own head during a moment of self-doubt. The internal committee you imagine scrutinizing your every decision does not exist in reality with anything close to the intensity you have assigned to it. This realization can initially feel deflating, even lonely, as though it diminishes your significance. But sitting with it longer reveals something closer to relief. If people are not, in fact, closely monitoring and judging your every choice, then an enormous portion of the anxiety you have carried was directed at an audience that was never paying the kind of attention you feared. The performance you have maintained, the careful management of impression, the anxious rehearsal before difficult conversations, much of this energy was spent for the benefit of witnesses who were, in the moment, thinking about themselves. This does not mean opinions never matter, or that reputation carries no real consequence. Some opinions, particularly those held by people with direct influence over your life, employers, close family, long-term partners, do carry genuine weight and deserve thoughtful consideration. The point is not that all opinions are irrelevant. The point is that the sheer volume of anxious anticipation most people carry about being watched and judged vastly exceeds the actual attention being paid to them. Recalibrating this ratio, understanding realistically how much space you occupy in the minds of others, is one of the most efficient ways to reduce unnecessary suffering, because it targets the fear at its actual source, an inflated, largely imaginary audience, rather than treating the symptoms one anxious moment at a time. Chapter 6. The difference between respect and approval. Many people spend years pursuing approval, while believing they are pursuing respect, and the confusion between these two things quietly damages nearly every important relationship in their lives. Approval is granted for compliance. It is offered when you agree, accommodate, or perform in a manner that pleases the person granting it. Respect is granted for integrity. It is offered when you demonstrate honesty, consistency, and the willingness to hold a position, even when it is inconvenient for the person observing you. These two forms of regard often feel similar in the moment they are received, both producing a brief sense of warmth and validation. But they are built on entirely different foundations, and only one of them is durable. Approval is inherently unstable, because it depends on continued accommodation. A person who earns approval by agreeing with everyone will find that approval evaporates the moment they express a differing opinion. This creates a subtle but exhausting trap, a requirement to continuously monitor and adjust behavior in order to maintain a form of regard that was never rooted in anything solid to begin with. The approval seeker often senses this instability without fully naming it, which produces a persistent, low-grade anxiety, a fear that the good opinion currently held of them could vanish at any moment if they fail to keep performing correctly. Respect operates according to a different logic entirely. It is not eroded by disagreement. In fact, it is frequently strengthened by it, provided the disagreement is expressed with honesty and consideration, rather than hostility. A person who respects you may disagree with your position and still hold you in higher regard for having stated it clearly and stood behind it, because the disagreement demonstrates something approval never requires: the presence of an actual, independent mind, rather than a reflection of their own preferences. This distinction becomes clearer when observing how people react to a colleague who consistently agrees with every proposal versus a colleague who occasionally, respectfully, raises a different perspective. The agreeable colleague may be liked in a surface sense, pleasant to work with, easy to manage, but they are rarely deeply trusted with difficult decisions because their agreement carries little informational value. Nobody knows whether they genuinely believe what they are saying, or whether they are simply avoiding friction. The colleague who occasionally disagrees, by contrast, becomes a person whose agreement actually means something, because it is understood to be genuine rather than automatic. Their respect is harder won, and, as a result, far more valuable when it is given. Many people avoid earning respect because the path toward it necessarily involves risking approval along the way. Expressing an honest opinion that differs from the group carries the immediate possibility of friction, discomfort, or disagreement. Maintaining a boundary risks disappointing someone in the short term. These short-term costs feel immediate and uncomfortable, while the long-term benefit, a life built on genuine respect rather than fragile approval, is more abstract and less immediately felt. This is why so many people choose the comfortable path of continuous accommodation, even when some part of them senses that this path is quietly costing them something important. Learning to prioritize respect over approval does not require becoming needlessly combative or disagreeable for its own sake. That would simply be another form of performance, this time aimed at appearing independent rather than appearing agreeable, but still fundamentally organized around the anticipated reaction of an audience. Genuine respect-earning behavior is quieter than that. It involves stating your actual position when it matters, honoring your commitments even when it would be easier to abandon them, and maintaining consistency between your private beliefs and your public behavior. It does not seek out conflict, but it does not avoid it reflexively either, because it understands that occasional friction is simply the cost of being a real, distinct person in relationship with others rather than an accommodating mirror. Over time, a life organized around earning respect rather than chasing approval produces relationships with a different quality, altogether sturdier, more honest, and considerably less exhausting to maintain. The people who remain close to you under this arrangement are there because they value who you actually are, not because you have successfully managed to avoid disappointing them. And the ones who drift away, having preferred the more agreeable, approval-seeking version of you, reveal something useful in their departure, that their regard was never truly for you in the first place, only for your compliance. Chapter 7. The moment opinion loses its grip. There is a specific turning point that many people describe, often with surprising clarity, when recounting how they finally stopped organizing their lives around the opinions of others. It rarely arrives through a gradual, gentle realization. More often, it arrives through exhaustion, crisis, or a moment of unexpected clarity forced by circumstance, a diagnosis, a loss, a public failure that somehow did not produce the catastrophic social consequences the person had spent years fearing. In that moment, something shifts, not through effort, but through direct experience that contradicts a belief that had never actually been tested. Exhaustion is one of the most common paths to this turning point. A person who has spent years carefully managing impressions, monitoring reactions, adjusting behavior to maintain approval, eventually reaches a point where the sheer effort required to sustain the performance becomes unsustainable. This exhaustion is not merely physical, it is the accumulated weight of thousands of small calculations. What to say, what to withhold, how to phrase a disagreement so it will not offend, how to appear successful without appearing arrogant. When this exhaustion reaches its peak, something in the person simply stops complying, not out of a deliberate decision to change, but because the old pattern has become genuinely impossible to maintain any longer. Crisis produces a similar shift through a different mechanism. A serious illness, the sudden loss of someone close, a significant failure that once would have felt unbearable. These experiences have a way of dramatically recalibrating what actually matters. A person who spent years anxious about a colleague's mild disapproval may find, after facing something genuinely threatening, that this old anxiety simply no longer registers with the same intensity. The perspective gained through genuine hardship has a way of exposing how much energy was previously spent on concerns that, in retrospect, carried almost no real weight at all. Perhaps the most instructive path toward this turning point, however, comes through direct contradiction of a long-held fear. Many people avoid a particular action for years, speaking an unpopular opinion, ending a relationship that no longer serves them, pursuing a path their family disapproves of because they have imagined a catastrophic social consequence that has never actually been tested. When circumstances eventually force the action anyway, sometimes through necessity rather than courage, the anticipated catastrophe frequently fails to materialize. The disapproval, if it arrives at all, proves survivable, often far less devastating than decades of anxious anticipation had predicted. This direct evidence, gathered through lived experience rather than reassurance from others, tends to be far more convincing than any amount of encouragement could ever be. What is common across each of these paths is a single underlying event, the collapse of a prediction that had never been accurately tested. The mind had constructed an elaborate, threatening scenario about what would happen if approval were withdrawn, and this scenario had been treated as though it were established fact rather than an untested hypothesis. The turning point occurs when reality finally intervenes and reveals the actual outcome, which is almost always considerably less catastrophic than the imagined one. This turning point does not eliminate the desire to be liked or respected. That desire is a normal, healthy part of being a social creature, and its complete absence would likely indicate something concerning rather than something enviable. What changes is the relationship between that desire and your actual decisions. Before the turning point, the desire for approval functions as a kind of veto power, capable of overriding your genuine preferences and values whenever the two come into conflict. After the turning point, the desire for approval remains present, but it no longer holds veto power. It becomes one consideration among several, weighed rather than obeyed. You do not need to wait for a crisis to arrive in order to access this shift. It can be deliberately practiced in small, manageable increments. By intentionally testing predictions you have long assumed to be true without ever actually testing them. Expressing a mild, honest disagreement in a low-stakes setting and observing the actual, rather than imagined, consequence. Declining an invitation without offering an elaborate justification. And noticing whether the relationship survives. Each small experiment gradually accumulates into the same kind of evidence that crisis or exhaustion provides all at once. Evidence that the fear had always been larger than the actual risk, and that the approval you had been so carefully protecting was rarely as fragile or as necessary as it had seemed. Chapter 8. Building an internal standard. Without a clear, deliberately constructed internal standard, a person will inevitably default to the loudest available external voice whenever a decision needs to be made. This is not a moral failing. It is simply what happens in the absence of a competing internal authority. If you have never taken the time to clearly define, for yourself, what constitutes success, integrity, or a life well lived, then the definitions offered by parents, culture, social media, and casual acquaintances will fill that vacancy by default, and you will find yourself measuring your life against standards you never actually chose. Building an internal standard begins with an uncomfortable but necessary form of honesty, the willingness to separate what you have been told to value from what you actually, upon reflection, value. This separation is more difficult than it initially sounds, because many inherited values feel indistinguishable from personal conviction, having been absorbed so early and so consistently that they seem like an innate part of your character rather than something installed by repeated external reinforcement. The examination requires slowing down enough to ask, of each significant value or ambition you hold, where it originally came from, and whether it still holds up when tested against your own honest experience, rather than simply against habit. This process is not about rejecting every inherited value out of some misguided desire to appear independent. Many values absorbed from family, mentors, or culture are genuinely sound and worth retaining, not because they were given to you, but because careful reflection confirms they align with what you actually believe to be true and important. The goal of this examination is not wholesale rejection. It is ownership, the transformation of an inherited belief into a chosen one, arrived at through your own reasoning rather than simply inherited through unexamined habit. Once this examination has produced a clearer picture of your actual values, the next task is translating those values into specific, usable standards, criteria concrete enough to actually guide a decision when the moment arrives. Vague aspirations such as wanting to be a good person offer little practical guidance in a specific moment of temptation or difficulty. A more useful internal standard might specify particular behaviors, honoring commitments even when it is inconvenient, speaking honestly, even when silence would be easier, treating people with respect regardless of what they can offer in return. These specific commitments function as a kind of internal constitution, a document you can consult when external pressure begins pulling you toward a decision that conflicts with what you actually believe. The value of this internal standard becomes most apparent in moments of genuine pressure, when the opinion of others points in one direction and your own considered judgment points in another. Without a clearly defined internal standard, these moments become disorienting, because you have no stable reference point against which to evaluate the competing pressure. With a clearly defined standard, these moments become considerably clearer, not necessarily easier in terms of emotional difficulty, but clearer in terms of what the right course of action actually is. You may still feel the discomfort of disappointing someone, but you will feel it while acting in alignment with something you have deliberately chosen, rather than while being pulled in whatever direction the loudest external voice happens to be pointing. An internal standard also provides a crucial form of stability during periods when external opinion is inconsistent or contradictory, which is far more common than most people acknowledge. Different people in your life will often hold conflicting expectations of you. One relationship rewarding a behavior that another relationship criticizes. Without an internal standard, navigating these contradictions produces constant, exhausting adjustment, a person perpetually shape-shifting to match whichever external expectation happens to be most immediately present. With an internal standard firmly in place, these contradictions lose much of their power to destabilize you, because you are no longer attempting to satisfy every external voice simultaneously. You are simply attempting to remain consistent with a standard you have already carefully chosen. Building this internal standard is not a single event, but an ongoing practice, refined continually as you gain new experience and encounter new situations that test its boundaries. It requires periodic revisiting, honest reassessment, and occasional revision as your understanding deepens. But once established with reasonable clarity, it provides something remarkably rare, a stable center of gravity that does not shift with every passing wind of external opinion, a place from which you can engage with the world's judgments without being uprooted by them. Chapter 9. The discipline of unbothered living. Indifference to unnecessary judgment is frequently mistaken for a fixed personality trait, something certain fortunate people are simply born possessing, while others are permanently excluded from it. This misunderstanding discourages many people from even attempting to develop this capacity, under the assumption that it is either present or absent from birth. In reality, the ability to remain unbothered by unnecessary opinion is closer to a discipline than a trait, built gradually through consistent, deliberate practice, in much the same way physical strength is built through repeated exercise, rather than granted instantly through wishful thinking. The first element of this discipline involves developing the capacity to notice. In the moment, when your attention has been captured by an opinion that carries no actual bearing on your life, this noticing is more difficult than it sounds, because the mind's habitual patterns often operate faster than conscious awareness. A passing comment can produce hours of internal rumination before the person even realizes they have been quietly absorbed by it. Building the discipline of unbothered living begins with slowing this process down, enough to catch it earlier, ideally within the first few moments, before the rumination has fully taken hold. Once the capture has been noticed, the second element involves a deliberate, practiced pause before responding emotionally or behaviorally to the opinion in question. This pause is not about suppressing the feeling entirely, which rarely works and often produces unresolved tension that resurfaces later in less controlled ways. It is about creating enough space between the trigger and the response to allow a more deliberate evaluation to occur. In that space, a simple question becomes available. Does this opinion, held by this particular person, actually carry consequences for my life? Or is it simply noise that I have habitually treated as significant? The third element of this discipline involves consciously redirecting attention away from the opinion and towards something within your actual control. An action aligned with your own values, a task that requires your focus, a person or activity that genuinely deserves your attention in that moment. This redirection is not avoidance, it is a deliberate choice about where limited attention will be invested, made with the understanding that attention given to an inconsequential opinion is attention withdrawn from something that actually matters. Like any discipline, this practice produces its most noticeable results, not immediately, but cumulatively, through consistent repetition over an extended period. The first few attempts at noticing, pausing, and redirecting will likely feel effortful and somewhat unnatural, requiring conscious attention that eventually, with sufficient repetition, becomes considerably more automatic. This is consistent with how most meaningful psychological change occurs, gradually, through repeated practice, rather than instantly, through a single moment of insight. An important component of this discipline involves distinguishing between opinions that genuinely deserve consideration and those that do not, because unbothered living is not the same as blank dismissal of all feedback. Some criticism, particularly from people with relevant expertise, or direct stake in your well-being contains genuinely useful information worth incorporating. The discipline being developed here is not indiscriminate deafness to all external input. It is discernment, the ability to quickly and accurately sort incoming opinion into categories worth genuine consideration, or simply noise to be acknowledged and released without further investment of emotional energy. Developing this discernment requires honest self-reflection about your own patterns. Some people tend to dismiss all criticism reflexively, a form of defensiveness that prevents genuine growth. Others absorb every piece of feedback with equal weight, a form of indiscriminate openness that leaves them perpetually destabilized by opinions that carry little actual relevance. The discipline of unbothered living sits between these two extremes, neither reflexively defensive nor indiscriminately absorptive, but carefully evaluative, weighing each piece of incoming opinion according to its actual source, relevance, and evidence, rather than according to its emotional volume. Over time, as this discipline strengthens through consistent practice, something notable begins to occur. The frequency and intensity of disturbance produced by external opinion gradually decreases, not because opinions have stopped being offered, but because your internal response to them has fundamentally changed. What once triggered hours of anxious rumination now produces, at most, a brief moment of consideration, followed by a return to whatever genuinely deserves your attention. This is not numbness or disconnection from the world. It is precision, a mind that has learned to allocate its limited attention deliberately rather than reactively, and in that precision lies a considerable measure of the power this entire journey has been building toward. Chapter 10. When criticism cannot touch you, there is a meaningful difference between hearing criticism and absorbing it as identity, and understanding this difference changes the entire emotional experience of being critiqued. Most people, upon receiving criticism, experience it as though it were a direct statement about their fundamental worth, rather than a specific observation about a particular action or choice. This conflation between behavior and identity is what makes criticism feel so consistently painful. Even when the criticism itself is minor, poorly delivered, or simply mistaken, consider the difference between two internal responses to the same piece of feedback. The first response processes criticism as information, a specific observation about a specific behavior that may or may not be accurate, and that carries no automatic implications about the person's overall worth or capability. The second response processes the identical criticism as verdict, treating the specific observation as though it were a comprehensive judgment about the person's entire character. The words received in both cases may be identical, but the emotional experience produced is entirely different, because the second response has silently expanded a narrow, specific comment into a sweeping global condemnation that the original speaker likely never intended. This expansion happens automatically for most people, a habit formed over years of treating external opinion as a primary source of self-definition. If your sense of worth has historically depended significantly on the approval of others, then any disapproval naturally feels threatening to your worth itself, because the two have become psychologically fused. Untangling this fusion is central to developing genuine resilience against criticism, because it allows a specific piece of feedback to be evaluated on its own terms, rather than immediately triggering a broader crisis about your fundamental value as a person. One practical method for creating this separation involves deliberately translating criticism into its most literal, narrow form before allowing any emotional response to develop. If a colleague says, "A particular report was poorly organized," the literal content of that statement concerns the organization of one specific document, nothing more. It does not, on its own, imply that you are incompetent, unintelligent, or unsuited for your role. Although an anxious mind will often leap immediately to these broader, unwarranted conclusions. Practicing the discipline of staying with the literal, narrow content of criticism, rather than allowing it to expand into a global judgment, considerably reduces its emotional impact. Another important consideration involves evaluating the source and context of criticism before deciding how much weight it deserves. Criticism from someone with genuine relevant expertise, offered in good faith, with specific and actionable detail, generally deserves serious consideration and may contain valuable information for growth. Criticism from someone with no particular expertise in the relevant area, offered carelessly or with apparent hostility, generally deserves considerably less weight, regardless of how emotionally sharp it may feel in the moment. Not all criticism is created equal, and part of developing resilience involves learning to sort criticism by its actual quality and relevance, rather than treating every piece of negative feedback with identical seriousness. It is also worth recognizing that criticism frequently reveals as much about the person delivering it as it does about the person receiving it. A pattern of consistently harsh, disproportionate criticism from a particular individual often reflects something about that person's own insecurities, frustrations, or unresolved issues, projected outward rather than accurately describing you. This is not an excuse to dismiss all criticism as merely a reflection of the critic's problems, which would simply be another form of defensive avoidance. It is rather an invitation to hold criticism with appropriate curiosity rather than immediate, total acceptance, asking honestly whether the specific content has merit, while remaining aware that the manner and intensity of delivery may say more about the critic than about you. As this capacity develops, criticism gradually stops functioning as an emotional emergency and begins functioning as simply one more piece of information to be evaluated among many. This does not mean criticism becomes entirely painless. Even a person with considerable resilience will feel some discomfort upon receiving pointed feedback, particularly from someone whose opinion genuinely matters to them. What changes is the duration and intensity of that discomfort, and crucially, whether it is allowed to metastasize into a broader crisis about identity and worth. A resilient response to criticism feels the initial sting, evaluates the content honestly, extracts whatever useful information may be present, and then releases the rest, returning relatively quickly to a stable internal baseline rather than remaining destabilized for days or weeks. This is the state in which criticism, while still heard, genuinely cannot touch the deeper foundation of who you understand yourself to be. Chapter 11. The freedom of being misread. One of the more counterintuitive discoveries along this path involves the considerable freedom found in allowing yourself to be misunderstood without rushing immediately to correct every inaccurate version of your intentions, choices, or character that circulates among other people. Most people experience an almost reflexive urgency around being understood correctly, a persistent discomfort when someone forms an inaccurate impression of them, followed by an immediate impulse to explain, clarify, and correct the record. This impulse feels protective, as though allowing a misunderstanding to stand unchallenged would somehow constitute a genuine loss. But examined closely, this impulse often costs considerably more than it protects. Every act of correction requires energy, attention, and often a kind of emotional exposure, the vulnerability of explaining yourself to someone who may or may not be genuinely interested in understanding accurately. When this impulse to correct becomes habitual, applied to every minor misunderstanding, regardless of its actual significance, it produces a persistent low-grade exhaustion, a life spent perpetually managing the accuracy of other people's impressions rather than simply living according to your own values and allowing those impressions to form as they will. This exhaustion accumulates quietly, often unnoticed, until it becomes significant enough to demand attention. Part of what makes this correction impulse so persistent is an underlying belief that a person's understanding of you carries real weight, that being misunderstood by them constitutes some form of genuine harm requiring active repair. But when this belief is examined honestly, particularly regarding people whose opinions carry little actual consequence for your life, casual acquaintances, distant relatives, strangers online, its foundation begins to look considerably less solid than it initially seemed. Their inaccurate impression of you, while perhaps mildly uncomfortable to sit with, rarely produces any meaningful consequence beyond the discomfort itself. Allowing misunderstanding to stand without correction requires tolerating a specific kind of discomfort. The sense that something incomplete or inaccurate about you is circulating in the world without your active intervention. This discomfort is real and should not be dismissed as trivial, but it is worth examining what precisely is being protected by the impulse to correct it. In many cases, upon honest reflection, what is actually being protected is not some genuine practical interest, but simply the old, familiar need for approval, the desire to be seen accurately, because being seen accurately has historically felt connected to being accepted. Releasing this compulsive need for accurate understanding does not mean abandoning honesty or genuine communication in relationships that actually matter to you. In close, significant relationships, where accurate understanding genuinely serves the connection, clarifying a misunderstanding remains a worthwhile investment of energy. The distinction being drawn here is not between honesty and dishonesty, but between relationships where clarification genuinely serves a meaningful purpose, and situations where the impulse to correct is simply an automatic, anxious reflex applied indiscriminately, regardless of actual stakes. There is also something quietly clarifying about accepting that you will inevitably be misread by some people, regardless of how carefully you communicate or how transparently you live. Human perception is inherently filtered through the observer's own history, biases, and limitations. No amount of careful explanation can fully control how another person's mind processes and interprets what they observe. Once this limitation is genuinely accepted, rather than fought against, a considerable portion of the anxious energy previously spent trying to manage every impression becomes available for other, more productive uses. This acceptance produces an unexpected form of freedom, a lightness that comes from no longer treating every inaccurate impression as an emergency requiring immediate response. You begin to notice that the world continues functioning perfectly well, even when a stranger's opinion of you remains slightly, or even significantly, inaccurate. Your actual life, your work, your close relationships, your sense of who you are, remains intact and unaffected by this inaccuracy, because it was never actually dependent on universal accurate understanding in the first place. What remains, once this dependency is released, is a considerably calmer relationship with the inevitable gap between how you actually are and how various people, with their own limited information and perspective, happen to perceive you. This gap, once accepted rather than anxiously managed, stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like simply an ordinary, unremarkable feature of existing among other minds that were never going to fully understand you anyway. Chapter 12. Power without performance. Genuine influence, the kind that produces real trust, real respect, and real impact, rarely originates from a person actively trying to be liked. It tends to originate from a person who no longer requires being liked as a precondition for acting with clarity and conviction. This distinction, subtle in description but significant in practice, explains why some individuals command attention and trust with apparent ease, while others, despite considerable effort invested in appearing likable and agreeable, often struggle to produce the same effect. A person actively performing for approval broadcasts a particular detectable quality, even when the performance is skillful. Something in their demeanor, their tendency to agree too readily, their difficulty holding a firm position under mild pressure, their subtle eagerness for reassurance, signals to observers that their behavior is being shaped by a need external to the immediate situation. People are often more perceptive of this dynamic than they consciously realize, and this perception, even when unspoken, tends to produce a corresponding reduction in trust. It is difficult to fully trust someone whose positions seem to shift according to whoever is currently in the room, because their agreement carries diminished informational value, offering little indication of what they genuinely believe. A person who has released the need for approval, by contrast, produces an entirely different impression, not through any deliberate strategy, but simply as a natural consequence of no longer organizing their behavior around anticipated reaction. Their agreement, when offered, is understood to be genuine, because it is not the automatic default. Their disagreement, when offered, is received with more weight, because it clearly required something to overcome, namely, the risk of disapproval, rather than being simply the path of least resistance. This consistency between internal belief and external expression produces a form of credibility that cannot be manufactured through performance, because performance, by its nature, is calibrated to audience reaction rather than to genuine internal conviction. This dynamic is frequently observable in leadership contexts, where the difference between a leader who seeks approval and one who has released that need becomes particularly consequential. A leader primarily motivated by the desire to be liked tends to avoid necessary but unpopular decisions, delay difficult conversations, and default toward whatever position seems least likely to generate friction in the moment. This avoidance often produces short-term comfort, but long-term instability, because problems requiring decisive action are repeatedly deferred rather than addressed. A leader who has released the need for approval, while still capable of genuine care and consideration for those they lead, is able to make necessary but unpopular decisions when circumstances require it, communicate difficult truths without excessive softening, and maintain consistent standards even when doing so temporarily reduces their popularity. Over time, this consistency tends to produce deeper trust than the more immediately agreeable alternative, because people understand that this leader's decisions are guided by genuine judgment rather than by a continuous effort to remain likable. It is worth clarifying that releasing the need for approval does not require or even benefit from, becoming needlessly harsh, dismissive, or indifferent to the genuine well-being of others. This would simply represent a different, equally distorted relationship to power, one organized around appearing tough or unaffected, rather than around genuine clarity and conviction. Authentic power without performance retains warmth, consideration, and care. What it releases is not kindness itself, but the anxious, compulsive need for that kindness to be immediately reciprocated with approval, in order to feel justified in offering it. The development of this quality tends to follow a recognizable pattern, gradually building through the practices discussed throughout this journey. Developing an internal standard, learning to tolerate criticism without absorbing it as identity, allowing misunderstanding to stand without compulsive correction. As these individual skills strengthen and integrate, a broader shift begins to emerge in how a person carries themselves, moves through disagreement, and makes decisions under pressure. This shift is rarely announced or dramatic. It tends to be noticed by others gradually, through an accumulating sense that this particular person can be relied upon to say what they actually mean and do what they actually believe, regardless of how the moment's social pressure happens to be pointing. This reliability, built patiently through consistent practice, rather than through any single decisive act, is the actual substance of power without performance, and it is available to anyone willing to undertake the gradual work required to develop it. Chapter 13. The Quiet Confidence of Self-Governance. There is a particular quality that emerges once a person has genuinely become their own final authority regarding matters of personal value, direction, and worth. This quality is difficult to describe precisely because it operates quietly, without drama or announcement, yet its effects extend into nearly every domain of a person's experience. It might best be described as self-governance, the internal state in which external opinion, however loudly expressed, functions more like weather passing through than like a verdict requiring immediate response. The distinction between weather and verdict is central to understanding this quality. A verdict demands response. It carries implicit authority over your next action, requiring either compliance or active resistance. Weather, by contrast, simply exists as a condition to be noted and, where relevant, accounted for, without carrying any inherent authority over your fundamental direction. A person operating from self-governance experiences external opinion in this second manner: present, noted, occasionally relevant to practical decisions, but never mistaken for a binding command about who they are permitted to be or what they are permitted to do. This shift does not occur through the elimination of caring what others think, an outcome that would be both unrealistic and, in most cases, undesirable, since some degree of social attunement remains genuinely valuable for maintaining healthy relationships and functioning effectively within communities. Rather, this shift occurs through a change in the location of ultimate authority. Before self-governance develops, external opinion functions as the final court of appeal, the place where questions about your worth, correctness, or direction are ultimately decided. After self-governance develops, external opinion becomes simply one input among several to be considered, while final authority resides with your own carefully examined judgment. This relocated authority produces a particular kind of stability that becomes evident in how a self-governing person handles disagreement and criticism. Because their sense of worth no longer depends on securing universal approval, disagreement no longer threatens their foundation in the way it once did. They can consider an opposing viewpoint with genuine openness, precisely because they are not defending a fragile position that requires protection from any challenge. Paradoxically, this openness often produces better decision-making than the defensive rigidity common among people whose sense of worth remains dependent on being right in the eyes of others. Because self-governing individuals can genuinely update their views when presented with compelling evidence, without experiencing that update as a threat to their fundamental identity. Self-governance also produces a distinctive quality in how a person handles success and failure, because their sense of worth is anchored internally rather than in the fluctuating verdict of external observers. Success does not produce the same inflated, precarious elation common in people whose worth depends heavily on approval, nor does failure produce the same devastating collapse. Both success and failure are received with a certain steadiness, evaluated honestly for their practical implications and lessons, without being allowed to swing the person's fundamental sense of value dramatically in either direction. This steadiness is not indifference to outcomes, which remain genuinely important to a self-governing person. It is simply the absence of the exaggerated emotional volatility that occurs when outcomes are treated as referendums on personal worth, rather than as practical results to be honestly assessed. It is worth emphasizing that self-governance is not a permanent, unshakable state achieved once and maintained automatically thereafter. Even individuals who have developed considerable capacity in this area experience moments of relapse, periods of particular stress, exhaustion, or vulnerability, during which old patterns of anxious approval seeking briefly resurface. This is not evidence of failure, but simply an accurate reflection of how deeply ingrained these earlier patterns typically are. The goal is not perfect, permanent immunity to the pull of external opinion, an unrealistic standard that would likely produce more frustration than benefit. The goal is a general, reliable tendency toward self-governance, strong enough to weather occasional lapses without collapsing entirely back into the old pattern of continuous, anxious performance. As this quality deepens through continued practice, it produces a form of confidence distinctly different from the loud, performative confidence often celebrated in popular culture. This is a quiet confidence, rarely announced, requiring no external validation to sustain itself, visible primarily through consistency, steadiness under pressure, and the simple, unremarkable ability to remain oneself across a wide range of social circumstances, regardless of who happens to be watching or what they happen to think. This quiet confidence, built gradually through the patient accumulation of the practices explored throughout this journey, represents perhaps the truest form of power available to a human being. Not power exercised over others, but power exercised over the one domain that was always, in truth, entirely your own to govern. Chapter 14. Relationships that survive indifference to opinion. A common fear when contemplating the release of approval-seeking behavior is that this shift will inevitably damage the very relationships that matter most, as though the willingness to disagree, hold boundaries, and act according to one's own judgment might drive away the people whose closeness has been carefully maintained through years of accommodation. This fear, while understandable, generally proves considerably overstated upon actual experience, and examining why reveals something important about the genuine nature of healthy connection. Relationships built and sustained primarily through one person's continuous accommodation of another's expectations are, by their structure, fragile, in a way that often goes unrecognized until tested. The accommodating party maintains the relationship's stability through constant, often exhausting effort, suppressing disagreement, absorbing minor slights without objection, and adjusting their own preferences to minimize friction. This arrangement can persist for years, appearing outwardly stable, while actually depending entirely on the continued willingness of one person to remain smaller than they otherwise might be. When this person eventually begins asserting their own genuine preferences and boundaries, a natural test occurs, revealing whether the relationship was actually built on mutual respect or, primarily, on convenient accommodation. Relationships that were genuinely built on respect and authentic connection tend to survive this test reasonably well, sometimes even strengthening as a result. A friend, family member, or partner who genuinely values you as a whole person, rather than valuing primarily your compliance, will generally accommodate the emergence of your more authentic self with reasonable grace, even if some initial adjustment period involves mild friction or confusion as the relationship's dynamics shift. This adjustment is not evidence that something has gone wrong. It is simply the natural process of a relationship recalibrating around a more accurate, less performed version of one of its participants. Relationships that were primarily built on your continued accommodation, however, often reveal their true nature during this same test, sometimes deteriorating or ending entirely once the accommodation is no longer reliably offered. This outcome, while frequently painful in the moment, ultimately provides valuable and accurate information. It reveals that the connection's stability was never actually rooted in genuine regard for you as a whole person, but primarily in your usefulness as an accommodating presence. Recognizing this, while difficult, is considerably more valuable than continuing to invest years of energy into a relationship whose stability depends entirely on your continued self-suppression. It is worth acknowledging honestly that not every relationship affected by this shift will end in a clean, decisive way. Many relationships exist in a middle ground containing genuine elements of authentic connection alongside significant elements of accommodation-dependent stability. These relationships often undergo a more complicated recalibration, neither ending entirely nor remaining entirely unchanged, but settling into a new, sometimes less intensive form that more accurately reflects what each person is genuinely willing and able to offer the other. This recalibration, while occasionally uncomfortable, frequently produces relationships that, while perhaps somewhat different in character than before, are considerably more honest and sustainable than their previous accommodation-dependent version. There is also an important distinction to maintain between releasing approval-seeking behavior and releasing genuine consideration, thoughtfulness, and care for the people in your life. The goal explored throughout this journey has never been indifference to others' well-being, which would represent an unhealthy overcorrection rather than genuine growth. A person practicing healthy self-governance remains capable of deep care, active listening, and genuine compromise in relationships that warrant it. What changes is not the presence of care, but its foundation, shifting from an anxious, approval-dependent motivation toward a freely chosen, secure motivation, offered because it genuinely reflects your values, rather than because withholding it feels dangerous. Over time, most people who undertake this shift discover that their closest, most important relationships not only survive the transition, but improve in quality, becoming characterized by greater honesty, deeper mutual respect, and a less exhausting overall dynamic than the accommodation-heavy pattern that preceded it. The relationships that fade away during this process, while sometimes painful to lose, typically prove, in retrospect, to have been relationships whose foundation was never as solid as it had appeared. What remains, after this natural sorting process has occurred, tends to be a smaller but considerably more genuine circle of connection, built not on your continuous performance of agreeableness, but on mutual recognition and respect for who each person actually is. Chapter 15. The person who no longer asks permission. At the end of this journey stands a particular kind of person, quiet, steady, and difficult to fully describe in any single sentence, because their most defining characteristic is an absence rather than a presence. They have stopped waiting to be told who they are allowed to become. This absence, the removal of a lifelong habit of seeking external permission before acting according to genuine conviction, produces effects that extend into every corner of a person's existence, from the smallest daily decisions to the largest questions of direction and purpose. This person did not arrive at this state through a single decisive transformation, but through the patient, cumulative practice of everything explored throughout this journey, noticing the invisible audience that had shaped decisions since childhood, understanding the ancient biological roots of the fear of disapproval, tracing the early origins of the watching mind, recognizing the cost that a borrowed identity had quietly exacted over years, correcting the wildly inflated assumption of how closely others were actually paying attention, learning to distinguish fragile approval from durable respect, experiencing the turning point where an old fear was finally tested against reality and found to be smaller than imagined, building a deliberate internal standard to replace the vacancy left by unexamined external expectation, practicing the discipline of remaining unbothered by unnecessary judgment, learning to receive criticism as information rather than verdict, discovering the freedom available in allowing occasional misunderstanding to stand uncorrected, developing an influence rooted in genuine conviction rather than performance, settling into the quiet confidence of self-governance, and finally, watching which relationships survived this transformation and understanding what that survival, or lack of it, genuinely revealed. Each of these stages, taken individually, produces a modest, incremental shift. Taken together, accumulated and integrated over sustained practice, they produce something considerably larger, a fundamental change in the relationship between a person and the world's constant, ongoing offering of opinion. This person still hears opinion. They are not deaf to it, nor would deafness to it represent a desirable outcome. What has changed is that opinion no longer arrives as command. It arrives as information, evaluated honestly, weighed appropriately, and either incorporated or released, according to genuine judgment, rather than automatic, anxious compliance. This transformation does not produce a person who has become indifferent to others, cold in their relationships, or dismissive of genuine feedback. If anything, the opposite tends to occur. Freed from the exhausting, distorting effort of constant approval management, this person often becomes considerably more present, more genuinely attentive, and more authentically engaged in their relationship than they were during the years spent performing. Their kindness, when offered, is chosen rather than compelled by fear. Their listening, when practiced, is genuine rather than strategically calculated to maintain a particular impression. Their disagreement, when necessary, is offered honestly rather than avoided out of anxiety. What this person has gained is not the absence of caring, but the presence of choice. They can still choose to consider another's opinion carefully, still choose to adjust their behavior in response to genuine feedback, still choose to compromise in relationships that warrant it. But these are now genuine choices, made from a place of internal stability, rather than automatic, anxious reflexes triggered by the mere presence of an observing audience. This distinction between compelled accommodation and chosen consideration represents the entire substance of the power this journey has been building toward from its very first chapter. It is worth acknowledging, honestly, that this state is not a permanent destination reached once and maintained effortlessly thereafter. The old patterns, built over years of early conditioning, do not disappear entirely. They fade, weaken, and lose much of their former authority. But they remain present in some diminished form, capable of briefly resurfacing during periods of particular stress, exhaustion, or vulnerability. The person who has undertaken this journey learns not to expect their complete elimination, but rather to recognize these occasional resurgences quickly, without alarm, returning with practiced ease to the more stable, self-governed state that has become their genuine, reliable default. What remains at the conclusion of this transformation is a person who moves through the world with a particular kind of ease, not because life has become simple or free of difficulty, but because the additional, unnecessary burden of constant approval seeking has finally been set down. They still face genuine challenges, genuine disagreements, genuine losses, but they face these things as themselves, fully, without the exhausting additional layer of managing how each moment will be perceived by an audience that, as this journey has revealed, was never watching nearly as closely, nor holding nearly as much power as their anxious mind had once believed. This is the final shape of the power promised at the beginning of this audiobook, not power exercised over others, but the far rarer, far more durable power of no longer requiring anyone else's permission to be exactly who you already are.